Hi, and welcome to Expanding Your Book Talking Audience with Social Tools. My name is Caitlin Brown, and I'm the Youth Services Librarian at Rod Library at the University of Northern Iowa in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a book talking program that I started about a year ago, and the ways in which I use technology to make it more accessible to the people that I'm hoping to serve. After I tell you a little bit about my program, I'm going to talk about how I think you could expand this model to serve teens or adults in your community from a teen services perspective. The model that I use is threefold. Um, it starts with a live event at its core, you'll see right here in the middle. And then to that live event, I offer remote simultaneous access. And then the big cloud surrounding it all is the idea of asynchronous availability for people who aren't able to be there live. I'm going to talk a little bit about how my event came to be and why I think each layer of this model is important. So my event started and was inspired by a live event that I used to attend at my local bookstore when I worked as a school librarian in Washington, D.C. Our independent bookstore there, Politics and Prose, holds a monthly book talking night for local librarians and some teachers, where the booksellers and book buyers in the children's and teens department talk about new books that they've received, what they're looking forward to hand selling, what really didn't turn out as well as they thought it might, what will appeal particularly to the curricular needs or local interests in our schools, and all the way down to what books have really strange trim sizes and will be hard to shelve, or what book was printed on surprisingly poor quality paper. It was an event that I found really indispensable to my own collection development. They would have all the physical books there for us to pass around. It was great to meet with other librarians and chat about what we were working on. The live part of it was really special to me. But then I moved to a new job and I moved halfway across the country, and I wasn't able to go there in person. Rather than miss out completely, though, a friend helped me out by letting me Skype in um, on her computer or call in on speakerphone to her phone when I was available and have a little bit of remote access to this event and still be able to participate in the way that worked best for me. As I mentioned at the beginning, I now live in Iowa, and I'm a youth services librarian at an academic library where I support the study of education and of children's literature on our campus. But I also try to support librarians working throughout the state. I tend to have a little bit more time for collection development in my month than most other librarians do, unless that's the focus of their job. And so I was learning a lot about books and seeing copies of books. I have a pretty healthy collection development budget, and I wanted to be able to share that information with librarians who found that helpful from a collection development standpoint. If you, like my mom, don't know exactly where Iowa is, I put a map in here for you. You can see we're kind of right in the middle of the country. It is very cold in the winter and hard to drive, um, 4 hours across the state to come to an event in person. And we are about the same size as Pennsylvania. We have a pretty sizable turf to cover. Unlike when I lived in DC, our schools and our librarians and our public libraries are also much more spread out. This is a population density map of Iowa. You can see that we have a few urban centers kind of smattered throughout the state, but in between there are a lot of counties that are fairly sparsely populated. They're much more rural, and librarians there might serve every student in a county, every student in two counties. I know one librarian who serves 4 counties in the course of a week and works in all of their schools. So a purely live event was not going to work. It's just not practical for me to expect some of the librarians that I work with to drive all the way out to Cedar Falls, which is part of this little population clump right here, to attend a monthly event. People can travel for conferences and things like that, but getting out here regularly was just unreasonable. So I tried to think about how I could create a heavily remote access event that would still create some of the camaraderie and the relationship building that I experienced at a live event. So that's where all three of these layers came in. I wanted to keep the core of the live event for people who were able to be here in person. That includes some local librarians, the instructors in our school library studies program, but also my children's literature students who sometimes will be encouraged by their professors to come out. At the same time, I knew that remote access would be essential to having a good population base attending my event. And because librarians have busy lives and strange schedules, I knew there was no possible time at which everyone would be available. And this would be a much more helpful service if I could provide asynchronous access to the information as well. So those are the three layers that I built. I hold a live event in our library about once a month. I have remote access available immediately by holding that meeting with a video conference component in Zoom. And then I make that video available as well as some files. I'll give you the specifics in just a bit, to librarians afterwards for them to look at and use at their own pace and when they're actually doing their collection development. And I found that those resources are also helpful to people who come in person, but want to look back later at the lists or at some of the slides. While I understand that many librarians are in a very different programming environment, I really think there's something to this model for everyone. Of course, we know well the people who love visiting our physical facilities and love coming to in-person programs, but adding layers of remote and asynchronous access will make our events more accessible to people who just physically can't get to the library, whether their schedule doesn't allow it, or they find the library building hostile, or they don't have transportation, or they don't have the physical ability to get into our buildings. Asynchronous availability also means that if people have to miss something, it's okay, and they can still be part of our community. They don't have to be able to be in a room in the library at a certain time to be programmed to and catered to by our information resources. So I had this great idea. I had this great event set up. My first month was a really big success. Some of the children's literature professors offered their students extra credit if they came and wrote a little paragraph about what they learned. So I had a full room to present to. I had books here in person for us to pass around. I had a few people joining us through Zoom. It was exactly what I had envisioned. Nothing could possibly go wrong. So, of course, the next month, no one offered extra credit to students to come, and I had an audience of about 4, a couple of people from school library studies, and a couple of students who work for me. Over time, I've had to adjust my expectations for each part of this event. I'm learning that for my audience, asynchronous participation is really, really important. And I never would have known that those people were out there if I hadn't offered them a way to participate whenever their planning period happens to be, when they're on their drive to work. Some people have told me that they listen to the video with their assistant while they're shelving after school. And while that might feel rude to do on a video conference, I think it's great. And I'm glad that they are able to find a way to fit that into their schedule. So I want to talk a little bit about specifically what I create and use to do this event in hopes that it will help make it more achievable for you. I'm talking about book talking because that's what I do. I think there's a great model here also to promote new books or thematic books to your teen patrons or your students, or to some other populations. So I hope that this information will be useful. For my librarians who are doing collection development, it's helpful for them if I provide a book list, and I think this is true for most book talking situations. I create a list in the same order that I'm going to talk about the books, and I make that available as a Google Doc. I also create slides that I use both in my live event and send out when I send out my video. And they include, as you can see here, very large images from the book, and I'll talk a little bit about specifically what images I pick. First, though, I'll mention the technology tools that I use at this stage. My slides are a template that I've modified pretty heavily from Slides Carnival to fit the colors and styles of my institution, but I love browsing through Slides Carnival as a way to start out presentations, so I like to always mention it when I'm talking to librarians. For my actual video conference and the creation of my video, I use Zoom, which is a video conferencing software. I started using Zoom because it's what my institution uses and installs on our computers and encourages, but I've come to really like it. It allows me to invite people to a meeting that they don't need special software to attend. They just have to go to a link and they can be right there participating. It allows me to record in that software the video conference and all of my participants and their chats and things like that. And it allows me to send out notifications ahead of time that have a link to where the event will be. So I think, if there's a different software that's common at your library, there's no reason not to use that, but I'll put in a good word for Zoom while I'm here. Here are some more specifics about the materials that I create. These have been kind of whittled down over time with some feedback from my participants. I had been putting almost full citations in my bibliography, but I heard from the librarians that I surveyed that they would much rather just have the author, title, and illustrator, and they could figure out the rest themselves. I'll sometimes verbally mention a publisher when I think it's significant that a certain house published a book, but it doesn't go in my bibliography anymore. My slides for each book always consist of the book cover for any book for any age. They also have, whenever possible, a sample page or illustration from the book. And this is something else that I added based on feedback. Some people rightly let me know that when they're looking particularly at picture books and graphic novels and other heavily visual texts, it's really helpful to see what font is used, how a page is laid out, what the illustration style looks like on a spread. I also find that this is really helpful for nonfiction that's heavily illustrated to know how many boxes there are going to be in sidebars, how the pictures are incorporated into the text. Sometimes the trim size of books is misleading as to how text versus image heavy they're going to be. And then the Zoom meeting, I'm able to schedule ahead of time and record, and then I just throw the video into a Google folder and share it out, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. I wanted to give you also a list of what I send out to my patrons and participants so that you'll have kind of a framework that you can adapt to your own uses. We run pretty successfully on a semester schedule because that's how my job runs. And I started this working primarily with school librarians who also are on a semester or an academic year calendar. So about once a semester, I send out a schedule of the days that I've booked for book talks in our computer lab. And then 1 or 2 days before the book talks are going to take place, I send out the Google Doc file with the bibliography, and I send out the scheduling and link information for the Zoom meeting. Then the event happens. I didn't actually put that on this list. And a day or two later, I will send out the recording, the slides, and again, a link to the bibliography. When I send these out, I use a link shortener that allows me to track click-throughs on them. And that's one of the things that I use to assess what's getting used, where is it important to spend my time. I've noticed a lot of people like to just use the slides because they're highly visual, and I think that's really neat. Every once in a while, I'll also send out a survey with a request for feedback, but I try to do that as rarely as possible. I found that people will send much better and more specific feedback when I have just a couple of questions and I send them just a couple of times a year and I'm not bugging them constantly for validation and information. If you have teens who are very opinionated and don't have a lot of other venues where they're constantly being asked for their feedback, you may find that more frequent requests work better, but that's what works for me. Okay. At this point, I want to talk about how I pick my books. I think, this will be specific to every library. Something that I've kind of come to terms with as I've done this for a year and a half now, is that every presentation doesn't have to and can't include everything for everyone. I do every month try to cover books from books for very young children and pre-K kind of ages up through teens, through the end of high school. If you remember from our very sparsely populated map of Iowa, there are many librarians who serve a full K-12 audience and are collecting at all of those age levels throughout a county. There are some who have much more specific jobs, but they know by now I'm always going to go in the same order. I'm always going to start with books for our youngest friends and work up to books for teens. So people who work with elementary schoolers only can drop out when I hit, the mid-YA section. And people who only work with teens can show up a little bit late and they won't miss a lot that's relevant to them. I also have stopped worrying so much about a deep genre balance every time I present because I present mostly to the same people. So if I have a month that's fantasy heavy and then I have a month that's contemporary and mystery heavy, the same people are getting those lists. They'll balance them out and collect what's best for them. If you anticipate a much more itinerant audience, it might be better to do a little bit more balancing. Every presentation every month, however, can represent a diverse array of readers, writers, and interests. I try to make sure that the presentations I'm putting together represent as many of the kids as possible that find themselves in our Iowa schools and public libraries, which is, every slice of humanity there is. And I've never really had a lot of trouble with that as long as I'm being intentional about it. There are a lot of great books out there. And I just try to make sure that every librarian will see all of their students represented and have as many options as possible to collect from. It also gives me a time to model how to book talk books about people of particular identity groups. For example, I'm very comfortable book talking books about LGBT characters, and I know not all of my librarians are. So it gives me a chance to practice what I'm going to say and say it confidently. and model that for librarians who might be less sure. Of course, I also talk to librarians who are very enthusiastic advocates for LGBT books and have been for a long time, and I learn a lot from them when I listen to their book talking. Along those lines, pre-planned book talks give you time to get things right. So it's okay to include books that are less your personal favorite and take some time mustering up some enthusiasm for another book about, in my case, it's submarines. I just don't care about submarines, but I know kids who love submarines. So when there's a great submarine book, I really try to do some research and find why this book is great about submarines and be able to share that rather than just share my just lack of enthusiasm. So now I'll move on to talk about some ways that you could consider adapting this to your library and your patrons. I'm going to use the classic 5 Ws here. But first, I want to show you a couple of models that offer a different approach to the same kind of multi-tiered programming. The first is an example that took a live-only program and turned it into an asynchronous-only program with the opportunity for live follow-up. And this is an example from the New Albany-Floyd County Public Library this is an example from the New Albany-Floyd County Public Library that's documented on Abby the Librarian's blog. They were doing book talking outreach to the schools that they serve and realized that if they created video book talks, they could serve more classrooms without having to find time in librarian schedules to physically visit every school. So she has examples on her blog of the videos that they made. They were geared to a specific grade level. So there are first grade book talks and second grade book talks and so on. And we're able to work together to select books, everybody prepare their book talks, videotape them, edit them together, and then share them out with all the classrooms that they serve. And I think that's a really neat thing to experiment with and see if it works for your community. The second example is an example from the Cape May Public Library in New Jersey, which decided to use Snapchat as a way to promote books from their collection to their teens and new adult patrons, so people in their teens and 20s. And this article talks in depth about why they chose Snapchat and how that's been a success for their library and what you might adapt from that. So using my example and those two examples to kind of triangulate you as starting points for inspiration, I'll talk through some things that I think could be helpful in your planning process and then send you off hopefully to launch your own event. The first is the who question. I think this is a model that can work for many different demographic groups that teen services librarians serve. Obviously, your teens are one. Parental adults who are curious to know what's going on in the library and in your collection might be a really viable demographic in some communities. Teachers and other librarians, this is a great way to build community and collegiality between people with instructional roles in your community, and you could even set up a book talk exchange of some kind where everyone gets to participate in an equal way. And of course, you may know of other stakeholders as well. Teens, I think, are a particularly interesting audience because we know that our teens in most communities are way too busy. And getting people to the library for a live event will always be a struggle when people have different meetings and practices and rehearsals every day of the week, every time of the day. By having a live event that has a remote and asynchronous quality, you can include teens who are waiting in the hallway at school for a practice to begin, but can use the school Wi-Fi, and also teens who don't have any spare time until they get home at 11 p.m., but then could flip through something that they had received from the library. So thinking about what you're going to promote in this program or talk about, for me, extreme currency is important. I'm talking about collection development, but for you, it might be better to link to a theme or a hook, a school assignment, an event that's happened in your community, or something around the world that your teens are really interested in. I also think planning is a good time to think about special interests that your audience has that you could cater to with this type of programming, or particular needs that this could fill in your community. Related to that is the question of where you're going to do this digitally and how you're going to set up the software and or the social media that you use to communicate with your teens. I think it's important before you get started to know what's going to happen with the tools that you're using. Will by default, they record the participants in your meeting. You can see my face is in this recording up in the corner. When I have other remote participants, if they join with video and audio, then their little video shows up and whatever conversation they're having is recorded on the video that I share out. My participants are adults and know that that's going to happen. With teens, it might be a better option to have video and audio turned off by default, unless you have a briefing and agreement process set up ahead of time. Related to that is the issue of how and should virtual participants be able to participate. If people who are participating virtually want to add questions or comments the way that someone in a live event would, how much will those be connected to them individually and to their name and identity? And how much will that be stored? You'll need to find the compromise that works for your event and for your community. Thinking about how access will be controlled is another important question. How will people find your information and log on to anything that's happening synchronously? Um, in every community, I think there's a different balance between what's easy enough for your teens to get into, while rigorous enough that it keeps out totally random people who you don't want in your program. And you will need to explore whatever tool you're using and its privacy settings for how to do that. Planning ahead for how your live event will be recorded is important too. When I do my event, I'm in the room that I use usually. You can see the webcam is facing me. What you can't see is the rows of chairs on the other side of the computer where my attendees sit. So if someone in my program asks a question, I can see them and I can see whatever they're referencing visually. And I do my best to scaffold that for my attendees, but whoever's watching the video will never see the face of the person asking the question. That might be a good model for you and it might not, but you'll want to be aware of how much you're recording of your teens and how much that's being shared with the world. The last important thing I think when picking a tool and configuring it is to know what internet access looks like in your community. If you're in a place where most of your teens have relatively low amounts of data available to them in a month, particularly if they're people who primarily access the internet through their phones, you may not want to choose something that requires them to watch an hour of streaming video the way that my book talks are set up. Most of my patrons watch them while they're at work on an internet connection. If you have, all high-speed internet connections in everyone's home in your community, you can do whatever you want. But if you have teens who have more limited access, it's good to think about solutions that work with them. How can you figure out what those are? I think it's really important to let your teens tell you where they are online and where they want the library to be. It's possible that there are social tools that your teens are using to connect where the appearance of the library and the attempt to barge into their conversations with book talks would be completely unwanted and would alienate your teens. It's also possible that they're on social tools where they would love to see the library as a passive participant in their lives. A third option is something where they would sign up just to receive notifications from you. It's possible that their Facebook accounts are mostly not in use or non-existent, but they would be happy to log in once a month to interact with the library. It's possible that that will never happen in your town. Your teens can tell you where they are and where they want the library to be, and whether they would prefer the library to come to them in a social network that they're already using, or to have something that exists in its own world in a Google Hangout, on the library website, somewhere where they can go to access it, but it won't be a part of their other conversations. As we move through our questions, of course, you need to think about when your event is going to happen. How often is too often versus how rarely is not enough. I think these are things we get a pretty good feel for in our programming. But also, what times of day are your participants available? We're used to thinking about in-person availability, when kids are in or out of school, when parents are available or not available. I think when developing layers of remote and asynchronous access, it's also important to think about when your participants are available remotely. Is there a time of day when a lot of kids are loitering around the school? They're not in class, but they're waiting for class to start, or they're waiting for after school activities to start, but they all have access to the school internet, or they have access to no internet whatsoever because their school is blacked out. Is there a particular time when your asynchronous access should be available so that people can go ahead and download or engage with it? Similarly, what will the tail be on your asynchronous access? If you're posting something like a video, will it ever be taken away? How long will people have to access it before it goes down? You may have things that never need revoking, but that's another privacy consideration to think about. And then, of course, the last and most important question, why are you doing this? How will you get the word out to people? I think it's important to use whatever tool you'll be programming in to communicate with your patrons, but also to use a wider marketing push and PR push so that your patrons can get into whatever virtual room you're expecting them to be in for your event, and hopefully into your physical room as well. I hope your live events will continue to be well attended. How will you justify your new program, both to your boss and other stakeholders who may need to approve it, but to people who ask just from your community why you're doing it this way, or why you're expecting the teens to care about the library when they're not in your building? And of course, is this the best fit for your library? I don't expect that this will be a great model for everyone, but I do think it's a great model for many libraries because it allows us to bring in people in our patron services group who have long been invisible to the library or underserved by the library because attendance at physical live events is not the best thing for them. With all new programs, of course, we want to think about assessment, so I brainstormed some different ways that you might plan to assess your program. Circulation numbers have not been a great count for me because many of the people that I book talk to are not patrons of my library. They're librarians who are buying things for their own collection. But if you're book talking, you may want to monitor circulation really carefully as you would do for an in-person book talking program. This is a great place to put a plug-in for your ebooks. If you're doing a book talk program that highlights materials in your physical collection and you're including a remote access component to it for people who are on their computers or their phones or their tablets at home, it would be really great if you could also include books that are available for them to check out and download through their devices rather than having to drive to the library now or walk to the library to make good on the things that you've book talked. So circulation can include digital use as well. Something that I do track is downloads and clicks on the remote materials that I provide. That helps me know which of the things that I'm providing people are really using and which, if I had to prioritize, I should continue to provide. And in weeks when nobody shows up in person or 5 people show up in person, it reassures me that there is a digital participation component that's making my preparation worthwhile, and that's nice. Live attendance, of course, is always a good way to count participation, live both in person and remotely. Reference interactions have been an interesting one for me. I've found some very direct collection development reference questions and what was that book you talked about, that one time reference questions, but also that this kind of multidimensional relationship building has helped to open me up for reference questions of all kinds from a broader patron base. I have people who have never set foot in my library who are still communicating with me about my job and about referencey kinds of things via email and other ways of connecting across the distance. Growth over time in program attendance and access, I think, is always an important thing to take into consideration. If only one person logs in remotely for your first mixed access event, you have a lot of percentage points you can gain just by getting 2 or 3 to come next time. And of course, particularly for people who are in school situations, I think tracking collaborations is a really important outcome, and the people who begin to see us as experts and trust us as partners on projects once they see us working in programs that highlight our expertise. So before you get started, I do want to encourage you to just go try this out. I'm a big believer in learning through failure and learning through partial success and successes that don't happen the way we expect them to. There are a few things I will really encourage you not to just wing and make up as you go along. One is privacy. I've talked a little bit about specific aspects of privacy that I think are particularly germane to this type of programming. But when you're working with teens or adults, their privacy is important and it's something that they deserve to be informed about and have the right to make decisions about. And I really encourage you to take that into consideration. I may have said already, authors' names, there's no reason to just make them up if you're not sure how to pronounce them. Teachingbooks.net has thousands of children's authors and illustrators pronouncing their names for you. Do a little research and make sure that you are presenting things accurately. Similarly, accurate descriptions of books are important. The great thing about doing book talks that I have to prepare to have slides and a list ready ahead of time is that I don't throw things in at the very last minute, and I have time to make sure that I'm accurately talking about the content of every book. Beyond those things, it's probably okay to just try stuff and see what happens. Teens are great for feedback and they're great at letting you know when things are not working. So try something out, listen to them, value their feedback, and try it again the next month or next week or whatever your period of repetition is. So that's all I have for you today. My contact information is here. You're more than welcome to email me with questions about setting up a combined live remote asynchronous presentation, or just about my program in general and what it looks like. I really like talking about this and talking about what I do and how. I've also included a link to my collection in case you're curious about why a university has a youth services collection and what I do in the course of a day or a month or a semester. I thank you for spending some time with me today in this asynchronous web conference presentation. And I hope this will encourage you to think about ways you can make your programs more accessible and use some technology to do that. Please be in touch, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Bye-bye.